Hi, I'm Femi OK, and you're in the stream. Today, the United Nations says money is not enough in dealing with the growing refugee crisis. So, which countries should be doing more? Digital producer Malika Bilal, we have a phrase in online digital world, slacktivism.
Yes.
But what's happening right now with the refugee crisis is the opposite of that. What do you have?
Complete opposite. And so I love that you brought that up. There's definitely a common theme online, and it's that people around the world say their own countries aren't doing enough to address this crisis and help migrants like these. So Al Balushi in Oman, it's one of the first ones, asks, why don't Gulf countries welcome the Syrians? Can anyone answer? In the UK, Tom Brake calls on his fellow citizens to join him in showing that refugees are welcome there. And Esther in New York, she reminds Americans it's not just Europe's migrant crisis. Tell the White House the U.S. needs to do more. And she links to a petition that has more than 56,000 signatures to date. Now, we know you want to weigh in as well, as you already have been. So send us your thoughts. Hashtag AJStream.
I'm Yasser Batar, and I'm the Community Outreach Coordinator for the Syrian Coalition DFLE mission, and I'm in the stream.
The UN's latest update on Syria says there's been a global failure to protect Syrian refugees, and as a result, 2,000 Syrians in the Mediterranean have drowned trying to make their way to Europe. This, as well as images of dead Syrian children washing up on beaches, has spurred public outrage, with many urging their own governments to do more. While some countries in Europe answered the call by offering to take in more Syrians, others around the world have kept their doors closed. Wealthy nations like the US, the UK and the oil-rich in the Gulf have been criticised for not taking in more refugees. While these countries are major donors to humanitarian assistance operations, the UN's Peter Sutherland says money is not enough.
I've also made the point that, to me, and this is a personal view, buying your way out of this is not satisfactory. Proximity doesn't count, capacity does count, and I do say that taking refugees is separate from giving money.
Online, the English hashtag refugees welcome and the Arabic welcoming Syria's refugees is a Gulf duty have been trending as more and more people call on their governments to open up their doors. So what's preventing them from doing so? To help us talk about this, we're joined by Melissa Fleming, Chief of Communications and spokesperson for UNHCR. Jane Kinnamont is the Deputy Head of the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House. Faisal Al-Azam is co-founder of the Syrian Kids Foundation. And right here in our studio, we have Hamad Al-Thunyan, and he is a Kuwaiti citizen who's a PhD candidate in political science at the University of Maryland. So welcome, everybody. Melissa, something has happened in this last week. Momentum. Presidents have been offering up their homes. Icelanders have been saying, come live with me. I mean, the response in, let's say, the last 10 days has been remarkable. What happened, Melissa?
Well, I think that the politicians of Europe did not have the pulse of their population. And the pulse of their population was appalled by the image of a truck on a Central European highway in the center of Austria, in which 71 human beings suffocated, and just days later, the corpse of the beautiful little boy, Aylan Kurdi, washing up on a Turkish shore. They did not believe that they would wake up in the morning and see their tabloids that the day before were quite anti-immigration, having that image on the front page and saying, what are you going to do about this? Welcome more Syrian refugees. And they did not predict the unbelievable welcome that Syrian refugees and Iraqi refugees and Afghan refugees were receiving as they arrived across the borders into Hungary, into Austria, and into Germany. This has changed the political landscape, and it's a people power movement. Compassion is winning over fear, and this is actually a wonderful thing, and it is changing politics. Probably not enough, but it's certainly a start.
Faisal, what do you make of this? I know that you've got a Syrian charity helping out refugees and a school, so you're educating kids on the border of Turkey and Syria. When you felt this sort of momentum going all of a sudden after years, what do you make of it?
I mean, it was very moving, but we have to remember that pictures like Aylan, the Syrians that have been following that conflict have seen similar pictures for the last 4 years. Chemical weapons have been used in Syria where children suffocated from sarin gas. Certain areas are under siege where children died as well from starvation. So it's not a phenomenon that started recently. What is recent is that Europe's tranquility has been shaken because these refugees were trying to find their way into Europe. And this is what started that movement. There's a very important point as well, is that I think in the last 4 years, the headlines in the media were very much associated to the political battle, if you wish, in Syria. So the headlines were often about ISIS, Assad, chemical weapons, vetoes in the UN Security Council. But behind all these political headlines, there was a real humanitarian tragedy, the largest refugee crisis since the Second World War. And it took the picture of that little boy, that cute boy that could have been, the child of any European or Canadian or American, etc., to actually put a human face on this crisis and mobilize people.
And I think that is, of course, part of the reason that so many people now are trying to point fingers, really, for lack of a better term, at who is responsible, which nations are responsible for stepping in. So this is one view. This is Sajid on Twitter, who says the U.S. government is moving more to accept refugees now, but countries in the Arab Peninsula, Saudi, Kuwait, etc., aren't stepping up. And Hamid, I'm going to give this to you, but he also got a rebuttal online. This is a tweet from Khali Swag, who says those countries are helping, but they're just not publicizing it. So what's happening behind the scenes that people may not know about?
Let me first say that the premises of the statement that the Gulf states are buying out their way out the Syrian crisis is basically, baseless. The second thing is that
Because
I'm getting to that in a second. First, the GCC states stood by the Syrian people from the beginning when few others did. The second thing, they provided more than $2.5 billion to the Syrian people because they feel it is their duty to do so. And Kuwait, the word refugee has a strong meaning. We used to be refugees when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And so we've been there. We know how it feels, and we feel for the Syrian people. It is no surprise that Kuwait hosted 3 international pledging conferences for Syria. Kuwait in the top 3 largest countries contributors to the Syrian people. And according to official figures, there are hundreds of thousands of Syrians living in Kuwait who can't go back to their country. We don't label them as refugees. In Saudi Arabia, you have more than 500,000. In the UAE, you have more than 200,000. 100,000 of them actually entered after 2011. In Kuwait, we have about 140,000.
Let me illustrate what you're saying here, because I'm just going to share this from you from IlmFed, and it says the number of Gulf states and who've been contributing what. And right up there, right at the top, we have Kuwait. The UAE is not far behind. Hundreds of thousands of dollars going to help Syrian refugees in one way or another. But we're missing a connection somewhere, because people in Gulf states are saying we need to do more. Where are we missing that connection? What's happening?
Definitely, we need to do more. But the point is that the GCC state did next to nothing. I don't think that's a fair assessment of what the GCC has done. And the GCC in Kuwait, for example, we have 145,000 people. They don't live in tents. They live in apartments and houses. They have study income. They have access to education and medical care. And what we need to face today.
So you're just not calling them refugees.
We're not calling them refugees.
But you're helping
we don't
Syrians who happen to be living in these countries.
Exactly. And there are ways. I think the Syrian people deserve more. And the GCC states can take more measures in order to cater for them and help them.
Well, Jane, it's actually on that point that I want you to pick up on, because there's a tweet here who pretty much echoed what Hamid said. He says the assumption that GCC states are not accommodating any refugees is unjust. They're just not registered as refugees. So explain to us why not.
It's more than a label. It really does matter, because recognizing somebody as a refugee gives them certain rights and certain legal protections, which in the Gulf states are lacking. So it's certainly a good thing that Syrians fleeing the conflict in some cases have been able to find a home and find work in the Gulf countries, but they don't have the rights to remain there that they would have if they were able to take asylum in one of the majority of the world's countries which has signed up to the International Convention on Refugees. The Gulf countries have never signed up to the international laws governing the refugee system. It's an old issue. It massively predates the Syrian conflict. It's not specific to Syrians, but it goes right back to earlier anxieties about giving permanent residence to Palestinians, questions about the long-term status of the migrant worker populations in the Gulf also play a role. So there are fears in the Gulf that refugee status could open a bigger can of worms. That said, as you say, there's a lot of public sympathy with the Syrian people, and you're hearing Gulf citizens themselves, in some cases, calling on the governments to do more.
Faisal, you're sitting there in Canada, a relatively wealthy nation. The US, just to the south of you, relatively wealthy. Are there other nations where you're feeling, I feel they could be helping Syrians a little bit more? What's going on?
Yeah, there are a lot of obstacles in Canada and the US to resettle Syrian refugees. In fact, in Canada, we have approximately 2,300 out of 4 million externally displaced Syrians. And by the way, often in the conversation, we forget about the internally displaced ones. There are around 8 million people inside of Syria that left their homes or their homes were destroyed, that live in very difficult conditions and often in areas deemed hard to reach areas where the UNHCR or UNICEF or the Red Cross is unable to reach. So these are as well important people that require protection that are not often part of the conversation. In terms of Canada and in the West, there has been a lot of obstacles, even when the government doesn't resettle refugees, and it's up to the private residents of these countries to sponsor these refugees. Very long delays. Very often they require as well recognition from the UNHCR, which has been very difficult to obtain. And as a consequence, very few refugees have made it here. Although we have a tremendous tradition, at least here in Canada, between 78 and 85, we resettled around 100,000 refugees from Indochina, which were fleeing communist persecution at the time. But then suddenly when it came to Syria, and I don't speak just for Canada, for other Western nations as well, every obstacle you can think of has been put, either a security issue or very long delays, or as what has been suggested, that the solution is political, we shouldn't invest in refugee, and we have donated in humanitarian aid, so no need to resettle refugees, etc. And the consequences are pictures like you've seen of Ilan, where the sea has become even safer than the land. This is the type of desperation that Syrians have reached.
Melissa, it seems that as we started our conversation, you said that empathy, connecting with Syrian refugees was so important. That was helping change people's minds, change governments' minds. You've just come back from Austria, where you spent some time with Syrian refugees. Can you share some of those stories, those experiences? Because then we connect even better with what's really going on down on the ground.
Yeah, well, I've always, I'm head of communications, so we've always been telling our teams, and over the years, please tell individual stories. If you knew them, you would care. If you knew them, there would be more support for them. They really are like you. I was at the Vienna. It was very strange because I live in Vienna on the weekend, and I walked 10 minutes from my apartment to the train station, where there were literally hundreds coming every hour of the people that I used to see inside Syria and in the neighboring countries arriving in my neighborhood. It was just this amazing, strange kind of thing. And then volunteers, there was probably one volunteer for every 2 refugee coming out from the population, trying to find all kinds of ways to help, from I am a hotspot, come stand next to me, to finding plugs for mobile phones, Starbucks coffee, whatever. I met a young woman, 30 years old, who looked at me when we sat down and had a cup of coffee, and she told me about her 15-day journey. And she asked me, why do people have to travel this way? And she told me that her husband had made it to Denmark a year before, got refugee status, and asked for family reunification, and it was refused, something I don't understand. And she then told me about her incredibly scary journey, a woman alone, 30-year-old alone, on a rubber dinghy with 50 people on it, all that trek that we all know of. And then she said, and Hungary is another chapter, and she just burst into tears, and she showed me bruises on her legs, scratches on her legs, bug bites, and swollen feet from having walked hours down the highway of Hungary. There's something wrong with this picture, but then she had this smile on her face and she was just about to reunite with her husband. I put that on Facebook and I've never had so much response, in a way because it had a happy end. She made it to Denmark, now she's a refugee, but she shouldn't have to go through this. And what we're seeing right now, and I'll just be really quick because I know I'm talking a bit longer than I've probably been allotted, but I feel very passionate about this, is what we're seeing now is that the inability of the world's powers to stop the conflict in Syria and the indifference to helping the victims enough. We're living, you know, our budgets are totally underfunded, which means that people are becoming, the victims, refugees in the neighboring countries, poorer and poorer. They're having to send their children to the fields to work, etc. This is, we're in a situation where the neighboring countries also feel unsupported. Of course they're going to start coming to Europe. And finally now, when it did arrive on Europe's doorstep, I think now the world has woken up. It took 2,700 people to die on the Mediterranean for the world to wake up. And I really, really hope now that there will be more resettlement spaces, much more money coming in, and the borders open to accept Syrian refugees finally. It is the time to do it now.
And Melissa, you said that you were passionate about this, and people online are just as passionate. I want to share a few sentiments from people. This is one person who says it's the government and not the people who are objecting to helping refugees. Human Rights tweets in, Canada hasn't done enough, in my opinion. In the city I live in, we've received one family of 4, and it's unacceptable. The doors must open wide. And Jane, I'm going to read one more. This is from Poland, who says, someone from Poland who says that Polish politicians are very divided in opinion, and it's due to reluctant society and incoming parliamentary elections. So you have 3 different opinions from all over the world there, basically saying that the citizenry is a lot more advanced than their government.
I'm not sure. I think here in Western Europe, we've seen for the last few years a lot of popular mobilization around anti-immigration parties. The reason for that is that Europe expanded, the European Union expanded massively a decade ago, and there's been a huge amount of migration from the poorer countries in Europe to the wealthier countries. That has driven down wages for a lot of people in the wealthier countries that have faced more competition. So in those countries, you've seen a big reaction against migration. That in turn has put many politicians on the defensive when it comes to migration, and the issue of refugees has been caught up in that much wider migration issue. It is very positive to see that when people have been able to mobilize in a big show of sympathy, leaders have been pushed into some action, as has happened in the UK with the pledge to slightly increase the number of Syrian refugees that are being taken. But it's still a drop in the ocean compared to the numbers who are likely continue to need to flee the conflict, which shows no end of winding down at all.
Mm-hmm. Let me just add, you know, the Syrian refugee crisis is not just a Middle East issue. It's a concern that requires global attention. So some European countries came out in the recent weeks when they said we'll, you know, accept Syrian refugees, most notably, you know, Sweden, Germany, and Austria. But there were countries, for example, as you said, the US and UK, who the US, for example, is going to accept 65,000. So if we basically use that refugee to population ratio used by the US officials and apply that to the GCC countries, for example, then Kuwait would receive 660,000 refugees, and Saudi Arabia would receive 5,600. We need to have more refugees. We already have that way beyond that number, and we need to have more Syrian refugees coming to the GCC. What we need is having an effective GCC policies of increasing the number of Syrian people residing in the GCC based on the objective of improving.
Have you seen any signs of that willing to happen? An awful lot of money is going to help alleviate the Syrian crisis, but
yes,
in terms of actual, the GCC getting together and say, okay, how do we make Syrians feel more at home here?
Well, it doesn't have to be a collective action problem. Yeah. It needs to be, you know, it can be done unilaterally. But, you know, as I said, the numbers speak for themselves about the number of Syrians in the GCC already. But what we can do, the objective of the policy should be improving the quality of life of Syrians. You know, Aylan Kurdi and other Syrians here in the studio that you can look at their pictures, they are not running away from the camps neighboring Syria because it's not safe. Some of them are definitely. But you know, some of them, they are paying a couple $1,000s to get on a boat heading to Europe. They want a better future, hope for tomorrow, and that should be the objective of any policy adopted by the GCC for the Syrian people. But let me just add one more thing.
Are you seeing, but see, the thing is, are you seeing that happening?
You know,
are you just wishing this?
No, I see that happening. I'm saying that we should push forward to increase the number of Syrians. The second point is that, let me just add one more thing.
Yeah, very briefly, because I want to share what people can actually do, and I think that's more important than
definitely. You know, you can't cover a bullet wound with a band-aid. You need to get the bullet out, and the bullet is Bashar al-Assad. I agree with Faisal with what he said. We need to support the Syrian refugees throughout this period, but a political solution must be reached.
Right, so I need to share with you this story. This is Gabriela Andreska. It's like one of the many stories that Melissa came across when she was talking to Syrian refugees in Austria. We met her in Macedonia. Have a look to see what she was doing. She's basically making lunches for all the Syrian refugees she could find. Have a look at this.
What we're doing is beastly. I mean, these are people, it's not cattle, and I cannot understand why the local population is so afraid of them. It feels really nice to help people. It gives meaning to your life, actually. We're all human beings, and this could happen to anyone.
So, Melissa, this can happen to anyone. We're seeing some amazing citizen charity around the world. But where do we go from here? Now that everybody's sort of mobilised and thinking this could be me, now what? Do you think a global reaction, is that even possible? Can we organise like that?
Well, I definitely think there is a momentum here. And, you know, I've been contacted by different groups, grassroots campaign groups like Avas. There is a momentum that people want to capitalize on, because what they want, I believe, what they've seen a signal of is that people want humanity to win over barbed wire. They don't want to see barbed wire anymore in Europe. They want to see an open society, a welcoming society to protect people who are victims. What I'm seeing a lot in Europe too is, even with the younger generation who didn't live through it, a real awareness of the history of their own continent and the dark history and the times when their ancestors were refugees themselves. So I think
let me just ask you
there's been a lot of debate, and I think the awareness also.
Let me just ask you the nitty-gritty, because in December you were on the stream, December 2014, saying we are running out of money to help the Syrian refugee crisis. We don't have enough money. I don't know how we're going to get through to January. In the last 10 days, how are the coffers looking for UNHCR?
Well, much better, I have to say.
All right.
Just from the private sector, in 4 days, we raised $13 million, and we're getting a lot of money.
All right.
And we're getting a lot of money in from governments, but again, this is directed right now to the European crisis. What we're saying also is we need more money for the Syrian refugees in the neighboring countries and the host countries that are supporting them.
Melissa is using her pitch well. Like, that's just the beginning. Don't stop giving. Malika.
Okay, so I have a question here from you via Twitter, and I know that you were on the Syria-Turkey border not too long ago. This is from Margaret, and she says, I want to know what Syrian refugees want themselves in the long term after immediate safety and needs are met. What are people telling you?
Well, the answer is simple. Syrians don't want to leave. These are people that are not leaving Syria to find a better economic opportunity, as is the definition of a migrant. Pre-2011, no Syrians were taking boats off Libya to reach Greece or Italy so that they can find their way to Germany or Sweden. Syrians want safety in Syria. Syrians right now are asking for safe zones, demilitarized zones. Some are asking for a no-fly zone. They want to be able to feel safe in Syria. As I said, when you've reached that point where you feel the water is safer than the land, then you have really reached a moment of desperation that unfortunately no one is addressing. So there is a lot of concentration on ISIS, as you know, but that's half of the story. The other half, as Hamad was suggesting, is these barrel bombs, the chlorine gas attacks that are taking place in Syria.
The point you're making, I actually want to end with a little Syrian refugee. He's 13-year-old Kinan. We're going to end with Kinan, but first of all, let me thank Faisal and Jane and Melissa and Hamad. We're taking you to the post show at stream.aljazeera.com. Let me leave you with a 13-year-old called Kinan, who's on the border of Hungary, hoping for a better life. Thanks for watching.
My message, please help the Syrian. The Syrians need help now. You just stop the war, and we don't want to go to Europe. Just stop the war in Syria. Just that.
Hello again, this is the Streams Online Post Show. We've been talking about the Syrian refugee crisis and the criticisms that have been directed at wealthy countries for either not opening their doors to Syrians or not taking in more. Just as you were chatting, Faisal, Hamad was like, I have something to add.
Definitely.
What was it that you wanted to add?
I think Faisal just mentioned a very important point. Let's not forget there are about 6.5 million Syrians displaced within Syria. These people need a no-fly zone. The Obama initiative to have a safe zone near the Turkish border must materialize. They've been sleeping on it lately. The second thing is that we need to ask who are the countries, international countries, increasing the number of refugees in Syria today. The number one country responsible for increasing the refugees in Syria is Iran, and Russia definitely is, I would say second to it, because Iran is providing basically arms and militias to the Assad regime, and they should basically stop their sectarian policies in the region.
See, we discussed this as we were talking about this program, and we thought it was almost the elephant in the room. But right now there are more efforts to help Syrian refugees getting out than there are in terms of how is there a political solution to this. So that's where we felt we were going to put our energies and efforts into it. But it's very right that you kind of bring that up. But nobody is doing, that we know, is doing anything. Jane, go ahead.
I'd like to come in on that because I think there have been increased diplomatic contacts, for instance, between Saudi Arabia and Russia, which is quite important. But the force that has really complicated the picture, of course, is Islamic State and its growth there. The international community is now quite divided between those such as most of the Gulf states and Turkey, who say Assad is the core of the problem. If you get rid of him, you'll be able to solve everything. And other countries, including some in Europe, who have suggested that actually toppling Assad might be more risky. They look at Libya, for instance. They see that ISIS is already strong in Syria, and they worry that there would be further instability. And certainly, you know, most people are going to be fleeing the violence of the regime, which has much more capacity to kill people than any of the militant factions. But there are also people fleeing from Islamic State in both Syria and Iraq. So a political solution is now going to have to be more complex than simply getting Assad out of power, and it needs to address what you do with the other extremists that have risen up in Syria.
I want to play a video comment that pretty much reiterates what you said just as forcefully, but it is quite interesting. So I want you to have a listen to what Hamish said and let me know what you think after.
There are three requirements for peace in Syria, in my opinion. Number one is the removal of Assad, who's responsible for the vast majority of deaths of civilians in Syria, and the reason most of the 5 million refugees who are on the border and in Europe. Number two is the creation of no-fly zones and safe zones to allow those refugees back in Syria, which most want. Number three is the defeat of ISIL, which is crucial to any sort of civilized future in Syria.
So Melissa, of course, this is well known, but what I want to show you is this tweet from ISA, who says all Syrian refugees cannot be adopted as a permanent solution. The refugee intake side by side, stopping the war, is the way out. So for UNHCR, what is the plan and how long is that plan in place for, knowing that there's no immediate end to this war?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, I'd completely agree with that. If we could have all the powers of the world using their influence to stop the war, that is obviously the solution. We're a little bit cautious about safe zones. We've had the experience of Srebrenica in the past. Who's going to guarantee that it's going to be safe? In any case, as long as people still are able to seek safety somewhere else, if they don't feel safe, I think that's important. Yeah, I mean, how long is this going to go on? We don't know. Every year we keep saying, you know, there are another million who have been forced to flee from their homes, and every year we keep saying we don't have enough money to give them the dignity of a decent life. And of course, now, you know, they are losing hope, and this is really probably the worst thing that can happen to a human being. is if you really feel like you can never restart your life because you're living in exile, where you're not able to work, where your children are not going to school, and you don't have enough money to subsist. So this is really the solution. Is let's mobilize to support the victims and at the same time mobilize to stop the war.
Faisal, let me show you a couple of headlines here. I'm interested on your take on them. So in the Telegraph, we've got the EU asking for compulsory redistribution of 160,000 migrants. Then we've got Finland's Prime Minister who said to Syrian refugees, you can come and live at my house. I'd love to follow that story up. The Pope recently said every Catholic parish in Europe should take in a refugee family. Icelanders, 11,000 Icelanders offering up their homes and their country as a refuge. And then in Germany, where a really interesting campaign started, which was Refugees Welcome, to kind of push back on the anti-refugee feeling that was seeming to go around Europe. When you see all of this, are you hopeful now?
Yeah, I mean, faith in humanity restored, as we say. It's tremendously moving, definitely. It is a momentum that, we have to captivate, and we need to keep the pressure. So anyone listening, please mobilize in your cities and keep that pressure on, because there is a direct correlation between political decisions and what the elite decides to do in terms of policy and public opinion. In the last 4 years, there was that boogeyman when it came to Syria. Arab country, Muslim majority, no good can ever come from the Middle East, security threat, etc. But that human side of Syria, and people are finally getting that this is a real tragedy, and the cause of this tragedy has been our indifference. So there is a momentum. We need to continue our activism, whether it's on social media or whether it's actually mobilizing on the streets.
We should also be remembering the countries in the region that have done so much in Jordan and Lebanon, where in Lebanon 1 in 6 people now is a Syrian refugee. They need to be saluted for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd like to add as well something quickly. So resettlement is crucial. And by the way, we can be creative. For example, adding family reunification programs, issuing humanitarian visas. Brazil and Argentina have done that for countries that are not signatory of the Refugee Convention. Humanitarian aid is crucial. Although the Gulf countries have done a lot, more can be done. For example, no Syrian can cross the border into Jordan right now. No Syrian can cross into Lebanon. I know cases of Syrians who got
unless they have a plane ticket to get out.
Yeah, and by the way, Melissa, I know actually Syrians that got a visa to come to Canada. They were requested to take their visa in Amman, and they were not allowed to board the plane, although the mission of their trip was just to get their visa.
Wow.
East of Syria is controlled by Daesh. They can't cross into Iraq. So all is left is Turkey for Syrians to get out of this hellhole. So humanitarian aid, increasing the refugee resettlement, and of course, which is the most important thing, protecting Syrians inside of Syria and not giving them a reason to actually leave from the start. And that can be established by safe zones, no-fly zones, no-kill zones, if you want to call them, or demilitarized zones.
See, we started off with a very complicated question. Well, it's a simple question, but it has a complicated answer, which is, why aren't wealthy countries doing more? It depends where in the world we're talking about. But Melissa, if you could boil it down, what would it be? I'm looking at a list here of contributions to the UNHCR. The United States is at the top. Lots of different countries are there, including a lot of private donors. Some private donors from some countries are doing amazing things and really high up on the list. I'm just thinking, why is it that the countries who can afford to are not giving as much as they could be?
Yeah. Well, I mean, they have been giving every year more. The problem is the numbers just keep increasing. We announced there were 60 million forcibly displaced people in the world this year, and that was almost 10 million more than last year.
Oh my goodness.
So it's just not keeping pace, the donations. And, I think we are saying that we need to ask governments to reprioritize. There's a lot of money out there being spent and going around. The humanitarian budgets of governments are very small, and these need to grow. So the wealthier countries need to just cough up more. And if they're not able to prevent conflicts and stop them, really, again, I just have to say, at least allow the victims to live in dignity, live in safety, and restart their lives. And also, just one last point, if you invest in refugees, if you invest in the education of the children, they are the future of the war-torn country that they fled, the country that is probably in the strategic interest and self-interest of the world to see peaceful in the future. So it's a really important investment too, even if you're only thinking of it in your own strategic
selfishly about the economy of your country. Yeah, there are benefits. Hamad, what did you want to say? Just wrap us up.
Basically, I just want to say that what we need to do is increase the support for the Syrians in the GCC. We can give them priority for job opportunities. We can allow Syrians living in the GCC to bring more family members. We should also focus on non-profit organizations like Layan GCC, Kuwaiti non-profit organization helping lots of Syrian refugees. We should empower these non-profit organizations and mobilize in order to, basically help them have better results on ground.
Malika.
Well, as we wait for governments to put more, I'm focusing on some of the citizen actions online. So I'll close us out with these two tweets. This is from MA, who echoes something that Melissa said a little bit earlier. I'd like them to stay in Germany, this person's home, to push our economy. And this next person, very kind of them, this is geolocated out of the US. You can see this tweet here. They sent it to the stream. I have space in my home in Illinois, in the US state, in the central US state. Send me a refugee family.
All right, and let me just show you this. This is kind of like to Melissa's point. Have a look here on my laptop. I tweeted this out. I got a lot of retweets. Best tweet on Twitter, in my opinion. So David Galbraith here. Very simple. A Syrian migrant's child.
His father is from Homs.
And I think you recognize who that is. So much could possibly come from actually welcoming Syrian refugees. That is not me being objective. Never mind. All right. Thank you to Hamad, to Melissa, to Jane, to Faisal. Thank you for being part of this conversation. Hopefully we've encouraged more people to see what they can do to help with the Syrian refugee crisis. Thanks for watching. Take care, everybody.